The last piece that we'll do today is quickly, I'll move through a little bit of the research that actually I began about 2 decades ago when I came out here to Denver to work with Professor Spilka. And we had begun a project at that point working with reach to recovery individuals, people surviving breast cancer, and working with that. And I asked them what was important in terms of their own spiritual development, in particular in the midst of this trauma. And one of the things that they indicated was that prayer was exceptionally important to them. We said, well, that's interesting. It fits right in with the main focus of our work. Let's see what is going on with that. And as we probed a little deeper into their responses, we very quickly found out that there was a relatively substantial percentage of individuals, tying in with David's perspective here, who said that they were atheists, but also that prayer was very important to them. And we said, that is truly fascinating. Exactly what do these individuals mean? And so in Bernie's inimitable fashion, we said before we answer that interesting question, however, there are other interesting questions we should also be addressing, preliminary remarks. And so we said, what do regular believers mean when they say they pray? We looked around and there was not much literature at that time. Ralph and some of his colleagues, Ron and Paul Williamson, Ron Morris and Paul Williamson were working on a project about prayer and what it meant to believers. Margaret Paloma and George Gallup also had a piece going. Janssen over in, oh my, I'm going to forget where he's at now. Belgium. Was also working on a project. And so we had about 3 or 4 labs going at the same time, and we started to find out there weren't a lot of core agreements on what was happening in terms of what believers meant. So 20 years later, we have yet to get back to the question of what the atheist meant, but we know that they're still there, and they may, in fact, according to David's work here today, they may still be engaging in prayer, and it's still going to be a fascinating question. With regard to where we have gone since that time, one of the places that, as I followed with Bernie's work and his trajectory, as Ralph pointed out earlier, on attribution theory, one of the keys was meaning, control, and esteem is sort of the tripartite way of thinking about what's happening with attribution. And that takes us to a particular place talking about what it is that prayer does in a person's life. What we're doing with our current research program, in conjunction with both Daniel McIntosh and Kara Cook, is to look at some ideas about what comes a little bit before even prayer has a chance to do things. Before prayer has a chance to provide meaning, control, and esteem, what are some of its origins? One of the ideas that we have hooked onto and have just begun to look at is this notion of mimicry. And the way in which mimicry is a very powerful aid in terms of social relationships. Also, Danny has some very nice work in terms of socially induced affect, and the way that the movement of the body back and forth between people really helps to create a sense of connection. This is important to us, we believe, because we've been framing the topic of prayer in terms of its ability to connect an individual with their God, with the divine, with people around them, with the physical world, and with their own sense of spirituality. And so what we're doing in terms of pushing forward the theory in terms of prayer is to look behind some of this and to say, in what way do worship services, in what way do sacred texts encourage people to engage in certain stylistic ways of their praying that actually end up looking like mimicry across different people, different time eras even. People assume classic, stereotypic kind of postures. We link that then in that notion of mimicry in with developing an emerging line of work on embodied cognition. To note that when the body is actually physically engaged, beyond just a cognitive level, but when there's a physiological component engaged as well, that there are some fascinating things that begin to happen. We're ready to begin pushing this out because we see that some of the things that are going on here with this embodied cognition can also be traced into the work of, if you're familiar with social psychological concept of flow, and this idea that when things really begin to happen most effectively is when we step back and let the learned responses or let the natural sort of responses take over. And we're wondering to what extent this notion of mimicry and flow can all be combined in terms of theoretical sort of notions to lead us back toward understanding where does prayer come from. That said, one of the things that we also want to make sure that we're very clear on is this notion, if you were at the presentation with Ralph and Margaret yesterday, discussion about methodological agnosticism. Making sure that when we talk about the origins of prayer, that it's very clear that what we're doing is talking within the boundaries of where it is that science can speak. And we're not trying to go beyond that. Because if you move into a theological realm, very quickly the understanding there becomes that prayer is not something that is directly part of the human will, but rather it's something that God is directing individuals to do. That's not a place where we go in terms of testing that, but it is a place where we want to talk to people, because if that is their perspective in which they engage prayer, that is the domain of a social scientist, to be able to talk about those sorts of things. And so when we're talking about origins, we're talking specifically about social scientific origins, but with an awareness, a sensitivity toward understanding the theological background that people bring with them into this context. And that's about all the time that we have at this point for that. We do, in this next session coming up, we have only 3 presentations. We're going to give Professor Spilka an unanticipated opportunity to respond to these, so he can sort of, we'll give him a heads up, he has another hour to sort of... and
we want a PowerPoint. We have questions for all of them also.
Right, and then we'll have questions for the entire group as well. But we do thank you for being here, and again, if you'd like to see some videotape that'll be available via the internet, send me an email and we'll be able to hook you up with that. We have any time at all? I don't have an actual time. No, we're flat out, so we'll let people who would like to shift off to another section do that, and then we'll be able to entertain the next speaker coming up in the next section. Thank you very much for being here.